The Best Christmas Present in the World, Part 2. Dearest Connie, I write to you in a much happier frame of mind because something wonderful has just happened that I must tell you about at once. We were all standing too in our trenches yesterday morning, Christmas morning. It was crisp and quiet all about, as beautiful a morning as I have ever seen, as cold and frosty as a Christmas morning should be. I should like to be able to tell you that we began it. But the truth, I'm ashamed to say, is that Fritz began it. First, someone saw a white flag waving from the trenches opposite. Then they were calling out to us from across no man's land, Happy Christmas, Tommy, Happy Christmas. When we had got over the surprise, some of us shouted back, Same to you, Fritz, same to you. I thought that we I thought that would be that. We all did. But then suddenly, one of them was up there in his grey greatcoat and waving a white flag. Don't shoot, lads, someone shouted. And no one did. Then there was another Fritz up on the parapet, and another. Keep your heads down, I told the men. It's a trick, but it wasn't. One of the Germans was waving a bottle above his head. It is Christmas Day, Tommy. We have schnapps, we have sausage. We meet you? Yes. By this time, there were dozens of them walking towards us across no man's land and not a rifle between them. Little Private Morris was the first up. Come on, boys. What are we waiting for? And then there was no stopping them. I was the officer. I should have stopped them there and then, I suppose. But the truth is that I never even occurred to me I should. All along their line and ours, I could see men walking slowly towards one another, grey coats, khaki coats meeting in the middle, and I was one of them. I was part of this. In the middle of the war, we were making peace. You cannot imagine, dearest Connie, my feelings as I looked into the eyes of the Fritz officer who approached me, hand outstretched. Hans Ulf, he said, gripping my hand warmly and holding it. I am from Dusseldorf. I play the cello in the orchestra. Happy Christmas. Captain Jim Macpherson, I replied, and a happy Christmas to you too. I am a school teacher from Dorset in the west of England. Ha, Dorset, he smiled. I know this place. I know it very well. We shared my rum ration and his excellent sausage. And we talked, Coney, how we talked. He spoke almost perfect English, but it turned out that he had never set foot in Dorset, never even been to England. He had learned all he knew of England from school and from reading books in English. His favorite writer was Thomas Hardy. His favorite book, Far from Madding Crowd. So out there in no man's land, we talked of Bathsheba and Gabriel Oak and Sergeant Troy and Dorset. He had a wife and one son, born just 6 months ago. As I looked about me, there were hurdles of khaki and grey everywhere, all over no man's land, smoking, laughing, talking, drinking, eating. Hans Ulf and I shared what was left of your wonderful Christmas cake, Coney. He thought the marzipan was the best he had ever tasted. I agreed. We agreed about everything, and he was my enemy. There never was a Christmas party like it, Coney. Then someone, I don't know who, brought out a football. Great coats were dumped in piles to make goal posts, and the next thing we knew it was Tommy against Fritz out in the middle of no man's land. Hans Ulf and I looked on and cheered, clapping our hands and stamping our feet, to keep out the cold as much as anything. There was a moment when I noticed our breaths mingling in the air between us. He saw it too and smiled. Jim Macpherson, he said after a while, I think this is how we should resolve this war. A football match. No one dies in a football match. No children are orphaned. No wives become widows. I would prefer cricket, I told him. Then we Tommies could be sure of winning, probably. We laughed at that, and together we watched the game. Sad to say, Coney, Fritz won, 2 goals to 1. But as Hans Ulf generously said, our goal was wider than theirs, so it wasn't quite fair. The time came, and all too soon, when the game was finished. The schnapps and the rum and the sausage had long since run out, and we knew it was all over. I wished Hans well and told him I hoped he would see his family again soon, that the fighting would end and we could all go home. I think that is what every soldier wants, on both sides. Hans Ulf said, "Take care, Jim Macpherson. I shall never forget this moment, nor you." He saluted and walked away from me slowly. Unwillingly, I felt. He turned to wave just once, and then became one of the hundreds of grey coated men drifting back towards their trenches. That night, back in our dugouts, we heard them singing a carol and singing it quite beautifully. It was Stilly Night, Silent Night. Our boys gave them rousing chorus of Wild Shepherds Watched. We exchanged carols for a while and then we all fell silent. We had had our time of peace and goodwill, a time I will treasure as long as I live. Dearest Coney, by Christmas time next year, this war will be nothing but a distant and terrible memory. I know from all that happened today how much both armies long for peace. We shall be together again soon, I am sure of it. Your loving Jim. Students, in the second part of the story, the author reads the letter and he understands that the owner of the desktop must have put it in there. This letter is written by Jim Macpherson, who was the captain of the English army, and he wrote it to his wife about the wonderful event that had happened on the battlefield on Christmas Day. And the letter describes about the wonderful event. The English and the Germans were at war. The two armies stood in their respective trenches on the two sides of the no man's land. Suddenly, Macpherson saw someone waving a white flag from the enemy side. Then he saw many German soldiers calling to them. They were wishing Happy Christmas to the English soldiers. Some English soldiers shouted back, "Same to you." The English thought that was all. To their surprise, they saw many Germans moving towards them. The captain was alarmed. It could be a trick, but it was not. They were bringing with them German wine, that is, schnapps, and sausage. Now, there were no rifles between the soldiers. They were hugging one another. The German officer moved towards Macpherson. They shook hands very warmly. Then the German officer said he was from Dusselford and he played cello in the orchestra. He gave his name as Hans Ulf. In return, Macpherson also introduced himself. He said that he was a school teacher from Dorset. Hans Ulf smiled and he said he knew Dorset. In fact, he had never been to England, but he knew English, and his favorite writer was Thomas Hardy. His favorite book was Far from the Madding Crowd. It was from there he had learnt all about Dorset. Macpherson shared with Hans Ulf the Christmas cake his wife had sent for him. Hans Ulf said the marzipan was the best he had ever tasted. It was a wonderful Christmas party. Then a soldier brought out a football. The soldiers played while Macpherson and Hans Ulf clapped and cheered. Hans Ulf suggested that the world would be much better if the problems were resolved by a football match instead of war. After the football match, all the drinks and eatables were consumed. Now it was time to part. Hans Ulf saluted Macpherson and walked away slowly and unwillingly. That night the Germans were heard singing a carol song, Silent Night. The English soldiers replied with a rousing chorus of another carol song, that is, Wild Shepherds Watched. They exchanged carols for a while and then it was all silence. Macpherson wrote in his letter that he would treasure those moments all his life. Jim Macpherson ended the letter, hoping that the war would end soon, and both the armies longed for peace, and he was sure that he would meet his wife and be together again.